Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Tom Rivera, and welcome to our oral history project. Today is November the 7th, and we are at the Fall Library at Cal State San Bernardino. And our interview session will be conducted by Mr. Frank Acosta, who is part of our committee. And Frank, you'll be interviewing me. And like I mentioned, I'm Dr. Tom Rivera. I retired from Cal State 3 years ago, and my official title now is Emeritus Associate Dean. So Frank, if we can get started with the interview?
Sure. We can start with your grandparents.
Papa Sisto and Mama Vitor are from Mexico, and they came to this country in the early or the late 1900s.
Do you know what part of Mexico?
They both came from the northern part of Jalisco, the little town called, Grandpa was from Santa Maria de Los Angeles, and Grandma was from Colotlan, Jalisco. And the little towns are about 50 miles close to Zacatecas. Grandma came here in 1897, and then Grandpa followed in 1899, and they both came to Los Angeles via the Southern Pacific Railroad. The husband of my grandmother was recruited to work for the railroad, and then my grandpa was recruited afterwards. But being in Los Angeles for 5 years or so, they got together, and Grandma had two kids, my Aunt Frances and my uncle Agustin. They got together, they came to Colton, and they came to Colton in 1905. That was a time when they were opening up the Pacific Fruit Express plant where they would manufacture and make ice for the boxcars that were transporting fruits and vegetables from Southern California and the low desert to all parts of California, all parts of the United States. And like I said, they came to Colton. When they arrived in Colton in 1905, they settled and lived in the workers' section house, which was located on the south side of Valley Boulevard, I Street, and at the end of Mount Vernon Boulevard. So they were there for several years. And then they moved close to the plant, about 2 blocks away from the plant, because the plant was located on M Street, and they moved to O Street where they bought a little property. And they were there. As a matter of fact, the property still belongs to the family.
And what's the address there?
427 East O Street, and my brother lives in the property now.
Now that area where the section house is all part of the freeway now, so that's gone.
Yes, and that's completely gone, Frank. It's like everything else. We've had a lot of changes over the last several years, but they lived there for several years before they bought their property on O Street.
All right. And where did your grandfather work? At the...
He worked at the PFE, the Pacific Fruit Express, and he was there when they first opened the plant in 1905.
What kind of work did he do there?
He was a laborer.
Okay.
At that point, during all those years, Frank, the early years, Mexicans could not rise above the position of laborer. They were laborers forever and ever. So they came in as laborers, hired as laborers, and they retired as laborers. And my grandpa retired as a laborer in 1959 when they closed the plant.
Did your grandmother work at all?
Not at all. She was a homemaker, and she took care of the family. We had, like I mentioned, she had 4 boys that were born in Colton. My uncle Cruz, who got killed in 1935. My uncle Isidro, who followed. And then my dad, Ruperto Rivera, he was born in 1919. And then my uncle Nacho, who was the youngest of the family.
No daughters?
No daughters. The only, my grandma and grandpa, You know, in the old days, Frank, we had that custom of adopting the youngest daughter of one of the relatives. So anyway, Anne Francis had a daughter, Margaret, and she was given to my grandparents so that she would take care of my grandparents and be with my grandparents. And she was, I guess, their only daughter that they had, Margaret, and she was raised by grandma and grandpa.
Okay. Now, you've mentioned that the community was a segregated community.
Mhm.
Do you want to explain a little bit of that?
The
You use the phrase surrounded by gringos and downtown Colton.
the our community of Colton was divided into two areas, and then the dividing line was the Southern Pacific Railroad. On the north end, we had the Gringo community, and these are the folks that were instrumental in building Colton and establishing the business that we had in Colton, and they were the ones that were very much able to get the railroad in Colton and develop from the railroad. And these were the people that were the movers and shakers of the community.
Many of them were growers, fruit growers.
Well, we had, as you know, Southern California in the 1860s started the citrus industry. And then the citrus industry covered most of Southern California from Pasadena all the way east to Redlands, and then from our San Bernardino all the way to Orange County, completely citrus. And we were the #1 citrus growing area in all of the world. And we shipped a lot of oranges out of the area. For example, when my grandpa was working at the PFE, they would manufacture ice to go in the boxcars, so the boxcars would have that temperature where the vegetables and fruit would not spoil. And it's estimated that in the 1920s, 1925 or so, they were able to ship 500 boxcars of oranges throughout the entire United States and all over the world. So it was a pretty active business that we had in the citrus industry. And the citrus industry also, Frank, like I mentioned, my grandfather came in because Southern Pacific came to Colton. But the citrus industry also brought a lot of Mexicans from Mexico during the latter part of the 1800s. And many of them landed, first of all, in Highland, East Highland, the little community of East Highland. And from East Highland, they had relatives there, they had jobs there picking oranges, and from there they moved to San Bernardino, and then many of them moved to Colton, like the Padilla family and the Sanchez family from that Highland area moved, and the Castorenas moved to Colton.
Now, did your grandparents then come directly to Colton, or did they go to East Highlands and then over to Colton?
Oh, like I mentioned, the citrus workers came from Mexico to Highland, that was citrus. But the Southern Pacific people either came directly from Mexico to a specific area. And, you know, El Paso was the place where everybody came to first of all, and then they branched over to Kansas City, Chicago, and many of those places where the railroad needed workers. So Grandpa came to Los Angeles, and from Los Angeles transferred to Colton.
Okay. Now, your grandfather, aside from being a family man and working at the PFE, was he also involved in the community in other ways?
Very little. My grandfather was kind of a very traditional kind of Mexican, you know, very serious, and didn't get too much involved with the community. But he belonged to the union, he belonged to the Progresistas, and he belonged to the Trabajadores Unidos. And the Trabajadores Unidos had their headquarters at the Portland cement plant, because we had a lot of Mexicans also that came from Mexico to work at the cement plant. And the cement plant started their business in 1890. So we had a lot of workers that worked in the cement plant. So we had those three businesses: the cement plant, which occupied many laborers. We had the PFE that also occupied many laborers, and we had the citrus industry that also occupied many of our people.
And then the fourth area that provided employment was the railroad itself.
Well, that's Southern Pacific.
Okay.
That's Southern Pacific
Right.
people, yeah. Yeah, so, and then we had the agriculture, the agriculture, which was a coolie ranch. Grandpa Mejia came from Aguascalientes, Mexico, and then he lived in Chamberino, New Mexico, and then from Chamberino in 1921, 22, came to Colton, and he was an agricultural worker, so he worked with the coolie ranch people. And what other areas that they had that raised crops, he worked for them.
Now, you mentioned the circus.
Oh, my grandpa, like I said, a very traditionalist, but he loved the circus. He loved the circus. So every year, the circus, I can't remember what the name of the Mexican circus that came to town, but it's from Los Angeles.
The one that I'm familiar with is Vargas.
Could be that one, but it was a Mexican circus that came to town every year, and Grandpa would take us to the circus. And that was a lot of fun. It was
Where did you go to where did they set up the circus?
in South Colton someplace, Frank, but I can't remember. I was a little guy. I was a little, maybe 4 or 5 years old, so I can't remember. But I do remember the circus. My grandpa, the only place that he took us was the circus, no other place. Maybe he took us grocery shopping because he didn't drive either. And he had a little bicycle that he would ride to work, or he would ride to the store. And in the handles of handlebars of the bicycle, he'd carry his little mochila, his little bag, and that's where he put his grocery stores. And again, I do remember that we lived about 4 blocks away from the grocery store, Rodriguez grocery store. He had an account there that he would purchase food, and they would put it on his bill, and then we would go home. But when we went with him, he would buy a soda, Frank.
Special treat.
He would buy a soda, and we never had sodas, so that was a special treat that he would provide for us. But the circus was also a wonderful treat for us. But he was very traditional, Frank. He kind of a no-nonsense kind of quiet person, and I remember my cousins, the daughters of my tia Pancha Francis. Here's his firstborn. He had my grandmother's firstborn. She had 4 daughters: Ruth, Mary, Joe, and then they had given Margaret to my grandparents. So when Ruth, Mary, and Joe would come to the house, they would go over and kiss my grandfather's hand.
A very traditional greeting for someone that people in the barrio respected. They're usually reserved for grandparents and padrinos.
And I didn't know that. That was completely new for me. So they did that, Frank, and I thought it was strange for me. It was strange for me. And, even though he worked for the railroad, he had passes to go to Mexico and pass to go to his hometown. I remember he went once. He went once back to his hometown, and that was the last time that he came, that he went. And I remember he bringing those bags, colorful bags made out of hemp.
Yes.
And he brought one for my mom, and I do remember that. But he never went back to Mexico.
Mm.
Yeah. And Grandma was very traditional. Ta chiquita. She was tiny, maybe 4'11", 4'10", 4'11", and very Indian features that she had. But she was the opposite of my grandfather. She loved to sing. She loved to dance.
That's where you get that from.
Anyway, Grandma was, and then she loved to give people food and welcome them and give them coffee. And, she was just a wonderful person that enjoyed being with people. She was going blind in her latter years, in the late 40s and 50s. She was going blind. She was a diabetic. And I remember she would be watering the plants outside. And we lived in the back house. You know, grandparents live in the front house. And la casita de atrás,
Right.
you know, very Mexican traditional,
Right.
¿verdad?
Probably built with wood from the railroad cars.
It was built, well, you're absolutely right, it was built with wood from the railroad cars. And anyway, we were next door to them in the back, and we would come and, we're tiny, you know, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old. And we would come and visit grandma. And she couldn't see well, and she was watering her plants. And then she could get us all wet. She couldn't see, so she get us all wet. And then, but that was kind of fun. The other thing that she liked to dance. She liked to sing and dance. We would gather at her kitchen, and the music. She would be listening to the radio, and then the music would play, and she liked the ta 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 ta, and yeah, and then she would grab us, and we would dance with her. We would dance with her in the kitchen, so she liked that. Entertainment, they had parties. They had parties, and then they would buy a calf, and they would invite all their friends and compadres, and then you know, my dad and my uncle Nacho, and they had a little garage, and in the little garage they would slaughter the calf, and then they would butcher the calf, and then they would prepare for the party that was going to take place that afternoon. And I remember these big cauldrons, Frank, big, huge cauldrons. They would put fire under those big cauldrons, and they would boil water. And then they would also get a whole bunch of chickens. And then they would, you know, strangle the chickens, twist their necks.
Did they grow? Did they have kitchen? I mean, excuse me. Did they have chickens there at the house, or?
We had chickens at the house, but they would buy chickens, other chickens, more chickens for the party, and they would wring their neck, and then they would put them in hot water, and then pluck the feathers from the hot water. I mean, after the hot water, and then after they pluck the feathers, they would put them on top of the fire, so they would burn the little
Singe the remnants of the feathers.
Yes, and then from there they would put them back into another pot of hot water and make caldo out of the chicken, and then that caldo was used to make the mole. So we had the mole, and they had the beans, and had the rice, we had the tortillas, and then some of the compadres played the guitar.
You had to use some of that caldo for the rice too.
Exactly. And the compadres would play the guitars, and they would play, and then Grandpa didn't dance, eh? So there's Grandma dancing all, you know, either by herself or with people in the.
And your grandma provided the tortillas?
The ladies came, and then they used you know, her kitchen, and they made all those things that needed to be made, the kitchen, the tortillas.
De mano.
De mano, yeah, tortillas de mano. Flour, they were flour tortillas, some corn tortillas, but most of them were flour tortillas, yeah. So the Mexican traditions continue with my grandparents.
And about how long did your grandparents remain?
Oh, let's see, Grandma passed away in '58, and I had just graduated from high school that year. And then Grandpa passed away in '72 or so. So I was lucky that I had Grandma during all those years. And I do remember Grandma, she would babysit for us, Frank. And Mom and Dad did not allow us to have coffee. But Grandma was an alcahuete, and she would, you know, in the morning, early in the morning, she'd get up, and her room was next to the kitchen. So we were in her bed, and my brother and I, and then she would get up early, and then she would bring us a little cup of coffee. Oh, that was really neat.
And did she make the coffee with more milk than
Yes,
water?
yes. So that was fun. That was good. Those good memories of my grandparents we were lucky that we lived next to the, but again, La Casita de Atrás, Frank, you know, that was a little old house that didn't have indoor plumbing. We had an outhouse. We were connected to the sewer, but we had an outhouse. And it was just like you said before, it was made out of that wood that was for the boxcars that were taken apart. But it was a very, very, I had no idea it was not a good looking house. Ta feita, but that was home until, throughout, until I was 18 years old.
Did you have a water tap on the property?
Yes, we did.
And an outdoor shower?
Didn't have, I don't remember the outdoor shower, but I know we bathed in the tubs.
Tinas?
In tinas.
Oh.
My mom, we had a small kitchen, and Mom would bring in the tina on Saturdays.
Heat up water?
She would heat up the water we had a little stove, an old stove, and she would heat up the water in the old stove and put it in the tinas, and then we'd take turns taking a bath. And that was Saturday night.
Uh-huh.
Mhm.
Okay. Now, the area where you grew up, you have very fond memories of that barrio.
I grew up in El Barrio La Paloma.
And which is approximately what area?
It would be, it would be